here, Battle of the River Plate. Christopher's got various exhibits as well. And I think we're ready to move on to Christopher, who will tell you all about the Battle of the River Plate.
Right, yes, thank you, Mark. Okay, good evening, all of you. And I see there's some repeat offenders here, so thank you for coming back. The talk I'm going to do tonight is particularly focused on the Battle of the River Plate. I have done another talk that looks at sort of family history as well. So, without further ado, I should get going. That's a picture of Graf Spee. Let's see what this technology works. Okay, political background. One of the fascinating things about the Battle of the River Plate was the background to it. As so often is the case, these things have a huge lead up to them. Treaty of Versailles, immediately after the First World War, was very hard on Germany. They were very much limited as to what they could do with their navy. They were limited on the size of the vessels. They were limited on the number of vessels. They were not allowed to build submarines. It really was quite tough for them. So that sort of set in chain a bit of a, I suppose, a resistance or a discomfort amongst the German people that they weren't able to properly defend themselves. So that went along for a while. However, it became increasingly clear that the Allies actually didn't bother to police the Treaty of Versailles. So the Germans fairly quickly realised that they could do a bit more than what they were allowed to do with the Treaty of Versailles. And that went on for a bit. They were limited to building ships less than 10,000 tons. As we'll see, the Graf Spee was actually just over 12,000 tons. And nobody actually picked up on this or noticed quite what was going on. It was a second attempt to sort of control things with the Anglo-German Treaty of 1936, and that really softened the Treaty of Versailles. It allowed them to start building submarines, and it set a target not a target, but it set a maximum limit for the German Navy to be no more than 1/3 the size of the British Navy. So that actually gave them some leeway. The Washington Agreement was an interesting one. This was almost a self-imposed limitation on the development of the Allied fleets, not just the UK, it was America and France as well. And that put in place restrictions not only on ship size, but also on gun size. So we ended up with a lot of ships being developed from the sort of 1930s, mid-1930s onwards, with relatively small guns. And that was a factor in the Battle of the River Plate. The other thing I think is relevant to all of this is the rise of fascism. Throughout Europe, you had this great turmoil and reaction following the First World War, the need for fundamental change in society, and indeed the rise of fascism. We saw Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, and of course Hitler in Germany. So this was quite a theme. We even had the Oswald Mosley and his black shirts in the UK. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot of social disquiet. It was a time of great change. The other issue that I think really made a difference was the economic position. Wars are incredibly expensive, not only in human terms, but in resource terms, and in the strain that they impose on economies. Pretty much every country was almost financially exhausted at the end of the First World War. You combine that with the desire for societal change, and not surprisingly, the last thing people want to spend money on is arms, ships and weapons. So And that certainly showed up in the UK fleet. The vast majority of the UK fleet at the beginning of the Second World War dated back to the First World War. And that was just purely lack of investment. There was also issues with materials and factory capacity. Again, a lot of these things had been destroyed and just weren't really up and running again. There was this desire to restore and renew the economy, and that was not going to be done if you were spending a lot of money on armaments. However, the German Navy had its own aspirations. It was seen as an opportunity to support growing confidence in German power. And there were two options, really, that the German Navy had. The first was to develop a balanced fleet. And to do that, it was not just building U-boats, it was not just building frigates, it was building a whole flotilla of different types of ships. To do that, Admiral Reeder, who was leading the German Navy, reckoned it would be the sort of middle 1940s before they could reach that point. That was his preferred option, to develop the balanced fleet. However, that didn't come into play because it became apparent that as Hitler started to develop his threats towards Poland, that things were going to move quicker than that. So the second option really became what they had to do, and that was to build up as far beyond the treaty limits as possible. When the Graf Spee was developed, they actually sort of hoodwinked the rest of the Allies. They said, oh no, it's a steel welded ship, it's not plated, it's much lighter, it's got diesel engines, not steam turbines. So there was this great sort of attempt to pull the wool over the eyes of the Allies. And in fairness, the Allies didn't really try and verify this, it just sort of went with the flow. British naval ambitions. By the late 1930s, it became clear that German naval power would focus on the destruction of merchant shipping. The reason for this is twofold. Firstly, the German Navy was not going to overtake the UK Navy or the Allied Navy in the foreseeable future, but it could pose a significant threat. The way of doing that was to focus on merchant shipping, to disrupt merchant shipping, and to look to deny your enemy the materials and the food that they needed to run their economy. So that's really what it was about. It also has the other benefit of requiring an awful lot of ships to try and hunt down these merchant raiders that the Germans used. I think somebody told me if you think of the continent of Asia and you think of the North Atlantic is something like 8 or 10 times bigger than the continent of Asia. So you've got this huge area of water. You've got ships that on a good day, before the development of radar, had a radius of vision of about 12 miles. So it really is a needle in a haystack. You've got this massive area. You've got these ships in good visibility being able to see 24 miles in total. So before the advent of radar, before the advent of cameras, before the advent of aviation, it really was very easy for these ships to hide. Sorry, the other point I'd make about hiding was radio communication was also pretty ropey. Generally, ships would relay messages one to another to get them back to particular bases. It was not sophisticated, it was not private, it was often heard by all sorts of people. So messages that were sent uncoded by the Admiralty or by ships would usually be picked up by all sorts of other people. So espionage in terms of radio was quite easy. The other thing that tended to happen, it took a long time for radio messages actually to make their way back to where they were intended. I mentioned earlier the British fleet was old, many ships dating back to the First World War. Exeter, Ajax and Achilles were the exception to this. They're all built in the 1930s. Worth also thinking about, Exeter I think was about 8,500 tonnes, Ajax and Achilles were just over 7,000 tonnes. The Graf Spee was 12,000 tonnes. So it's a much bigger ship, it's got much bigger guns, as we'll come on to later. The Washington Naval Conference really was quite a restriction on the Allies. As I say, they were limited to 6-inch guns. The Graf Spee had 8-inch guns, and we'll come on later to the difference that makes in terms of range and firepower. But it was significant, and that was a self-imposed restriction, probably with the best of intentions in terms of trying to give the Germans some confidence that they were not about to be attacked. Okay, lead up to the outbreak of the war. The Graf Spee actually set off from Germany in August time, and it sails south. It sails for South America, round the north of Scotland, and into the Atlantic without lights or radio, and it wasn't spotted. It wasn't picked up. The Admiral Scheer, which sailed about a fortnight later, did pretty much the same, but stayed in the North Atlantic. That was spotted and it was reported to the Admiralty, but about 10 days later. So again, any hope of cutting them off in the north of Scotland or anything, that opportunity was missed. So these two ships had escaped from Germany and were therefore free to roam. The Admiralty did have a plan. They were going to try and cut off the German fleet at the north of Scotland, where the sea is relatively narrow between there and the Nordic countries, where you've got it's about 200 miles wide. But as I say, on this occasion that didn't work. There was also an acknowledgement by the Navy that even if they had stopped them there, the likelihood of bombers and other forms of attack on the UK was huge, so it wasn't going to cure the problem. The Altmark is an interesting part of this story. This was a disguised supply ship, I think originally Dutch origins. It didn't look like a German supply ship, but that's what it was. And its captain was a chap called Captain Dow, who was a Nazi sympathiser. Thank you. Yeah, so that was an interesting tale. The Altmark actually was used by the Graf Spee to carry prisoners as well as delivering supplies to the ship. HMS Exeter was sent to South Africa to support the South American division. Commodore Harwood was an interesting character. He'd actually spent 3 years in South America before the start of the World War. He was well respected in Argentina and Uruguay. He'd made the effort to learn Spanish, albeit not very well, and was renowned for his grammatical errors. But he was well respected, and that respect and support of him was actually to pay dividends in this story. U-boats were stationed in the Atlantic. This is another one. The British intelligence suddenly becomes aware of a huge order for copper, lead and rubber by Germany. It was already known prior to 1939 that the Dutch were building U-boats on behalf of Germany. But this was the real giveaway, that they ordered all these materials right at just before the outset of the war. Right. The Graf Spee assumed her role as merchant raider as soon as Germany invaded Poland in September 39. Straight away, she then looked to sink merchant shipping. Very effective in that role, she sank over 10 ships in the 3 months between the start of the war and Battle of the River Plate. Something like 50,000 tons of merchant shipping was sunk. To her great credit, nobody was killed. The Graf Spee and her captain Langsdorff went to great pains and some risk to take off the merchant sailors from the ships before the ships were destroyed. The prisoners from those ships were actually either decanted into the Altmark, the supply ship, or they were encouraged to row to the shore if they were close enough to the shore, which in turn released some information about where the Graf Spee was, because obviously those sailors coming ashore would be interviewed and would disclose what they knew about their position. The other thing that the Graf Spee did very effectively at that time was disguise its name, and on many occasions it was recorded as the Admiral Scheer. They also on occasions put up a plywood additional funnel on the ship to give it a different appearance, just to add to the confusion. So there's all sorts of fun and games going on to try and create the myth that there were at least 2 merchant raiders at war. And this was all before the time of drones and satellites and all the rest of it. So these things really were just carried by word of mouth. That's a picture of the Graf Spee. That's a picture of the Altmark. Its primary duty was carrying fuel. One of the great things in naval battles is making sure you've got enough fuel. Obviously the whole thing of massive distances means it's very easy to be caught out if you don't get your supplies under order. That's HMS Achilles. That's Exeter. Exeter is the older and heavier ship. And Exeter had the larger guns, but not as large as the Graf Spee. Okay. This was the sort of the immediate background to the battle. The Doric Star, which is the British merchant ship, managed to send a Morse code message. And by pure luck, that was picked up by other ships immediately in the area, and it was eventually relayed back to the Admiralty. But that took several days for that to get back, and that was just the nature of radio communication in those days. Said that she was being attacked by a seaplane. The reason that she was attacked by a seaplane was that the Graf Spee detected that she was sending a message, so the seaplane was sent to basically knock out the aerial and make sure that the message couldn't be sent. But again, nobody was killed in that incident. This is the other thing that happened. There were other ships in the North Atlantic, and I'm told proceed with all dispatch means get the hell down there. But it takes time, and those ships would not arrive in time. And this comes on later in the story that, again, it's the whole smoke and mirrors, the belief and the illusion that there were other ships that were going to come into play. Again, on the 3rd of December, the Tiora managed to get a partial signal through. And again, that eventually got back to the Admiralty. So they now had 2 positions where the Graf Spee was on that day. And this is the point about changing the name. This encouraged speculation and confusion about the possibility of there being two raiders. And this is the clever bit. Commodore Harwood looked at where the Graf Spee was, and he had to make a guess where it would go. Montevideo was an attractive location for it because there was an awful lot of traffic, merchant traffic coming out from Argentina, from Uruguay, with materials for the United Kingdom and Europe. So it was definitely a possibility. There were other possibilities. Rio de Janeiro was considered. The other thing, the Graf Spee could have just moved on somewhere else. So there was no certainty that it would come to Montevideo. And this is the other thing. The Navy were quite clear about the abilities of the Graf Spee. They knew its speed, they knew its size, they knew its armaments. So they reckoned it would get there by the 3rd, to Rio de Janeiro by the 12th, or Montevideo by the 13th. They're actually spot on that, as it arrived sort of 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning. The Falklands was the other question mark. The Falklands was largely unprotected. It did have a naval base on it in the Second World War. HMS Cumberland was down there, which was the sister ship of HMS Exeter, and that was the sort of fig leaf to protect the Falklands. So Harwood made his decision, leave Cumberland where it was, and Achilles to proceed to Montevideo with the other 2 ships. For those of you who struggle with geography, and I include myself in that, this is a map of South America, so we're roughly sort of 2/3 of the way down South America. You've got Uruguay there, and you've got Argentina there. Both Uruguay and Argentina had quite a large resident German population, so there was residual support there for the Germans. Graf Spee had 11-inch guns, so this was a huge potential advantage, which never really played out. Those guns had a far greater range, as we'll see in a minute. They delivered a far bigger punch than the smaller 6- and 8-inch guns. By chance, that advantage didn't play out. It would have been much to the Graf Spee's advantage if it had managed to position itself so it could have launched an attack at a greater distance, but it wasn't to be. Broadside from the Graf Spee of just over £4,000. From the Exeter, 1,600. Achilles or Ajax, 900. So you can see the difference in terms of the actual capabilities of the individual ships. The only advantage the small ships had was they could reload more quickly because the armaments were lighter. They didn't have the same problems of refrigeration that the Graf Spee had, and was one of its problems when it suffered in the battle. But nevertheless, you can see the difference in terms of who packs the biggest punch. It is considerable. One advantage the Achilles and Ajax did have is they were marginally quicker. Capacity for 32 knots as opposed to 28. So not a huge advantage, but enough to get away. Harwood had guessed correctly, and sure enough, on the 13th of December, the ships spotted each other literally within minutes of each other. There was a little bit of confusion first on, not surprising. Langsdorff had presumed and hoped, I think, that there was a convoy. He was hoping to sink those ships and then attack the convoy. 5 minutes later, after they're initially identified, the Graf Spee correctly identified the ships. It was 6:10, Ajax reports smoke on the horizon. Just after 6:15, identifies a British battleship. Yeah, I think it's worth saying that Harwood had practiced for this moment, how he would use the 3 ships, and his hope was that Exeter would initially draw the fire from the Graf Spee. This last point about using larger guns, that never occurred because when the ships actually saw each other, they were already in range, so that advantage was lost. And this is the sort of timescale of the battle. Starts here, we've got Exeter, Ajax and Achilles. Exeter sails off that way, Ajax and Achilles off this way. Graf Spee opens fire just after 6:15, then creates a lot of smoke and turns around at 7:25 and starts to make its way back to Montevideo. This phase of the battle lasted just over an hour. There was a lot of exchanging of firepower. Basically, Exeter, as we come on to in a minute, took the greatest punishment, and then heads off for the Falkland Islands to nurse its wounds. And the Graf Spee is pursued by Ajax and Achilles, and that pursuit went on for about 14 hours until the Graf Spee actually made it into Montevideo harbour. Some unexpected results. The Graf Spee had suffered a lot more damage than was initially believed by the British. Destruction of her galley, numerous holes in the hull, destruction of the spotter plate, 37 men were killed. The other thing that isn't on there that did happen is there was a cooling system for the munitions, and that was also put out of order. None of these things were beyond repair, but repairs take time, and this is where the difficulties for the Graf Spee really started. The Exeter was the most seriously damaged. It was leaking, taking on water, and its maximum speed was down to 14 knots. And it basically limped its way to the Falkland Islands for repairs, and it was there for about 3 months being repaired. A total of 53 men killed on the Exeter. HMS Ajax, hit by 7 shells, much of the bridge destroyed, 2 gun turrets disabled, but repaired overnight, 7 men killed. So again, it took a fair pounding. Achilles suffered the least damage, shrapnel damage to the bridge and the deck, 4 men killed. So overall, 64, there's over 100 men killed in that battle. But that wasn't the end of it. The first battle was ferocious, but it was not conclusive. The Graf Spee made it into Montevideo, which is part of Uruguay, which was a neutral port. So there was no scrapping in Montevideo, but other things went on. Uruguay was determined to actually abide by the international rules, and there was a lot of diplomatic action now to see how long the Graf Spee would be allowed to remain in harbour beyond the 17th of December, which was the 4 days that the Uruguayans initially granted. The test was you could make the ship seaworthy but not battle-worthy. So you could patch up the holes, you could fix the galley, you could get the thing running, but you were not to rebuild the armaments. It was a difficult one. Germans were seeking a period of 2 weeks. There was lots of diplomatic exchanges and all sorts of things went on around that. And this is probably where Commodore Harwood's good name actually was well used. The British did have a dilemma on their hands. They actually wanted to delay the sailing of Graf Spee to allow the other capital ships to come into the area. However, they didn't want to promote that line, so they had to, that was their intention, but what they had to say was, actually, we want the ship out there as quickly as possible, we want to finish her off. So there was now this situation of double bluff. There are also rules about warships not being allowed out of neutral ports if a merchant ship has gone out within the previous 24 hours. So there's all sorts of things going on with ships being let out and all sorts of shenanigans and false radio messages. And it really was quite a masterful false trail of messages that were leaked and actually believed by the Germans. And it was this belief that was probably critical to the outcome of this battle. At the end of the day, there was only Ajax and Achilles, thus HMS Cumberland had now come up from the Falklands to replace the stricken Exeter. The scuttling of the Graf Spee, no, my computer's doing something strange. Bear with me a second. Try again. Germany had approved an attempt to sail the Graf Spee into neutral waters and was hoping that they could just sort of nip round the coast and get into Argentina. Captain Langsdorff was not keen on this because of the shallow muddy waters of the River Plate, and he was worried about the engines becoming clogged with mud and overheating and him becoming a sitting duck. So he was not keen on that. He was under a lot of pressure to actually go out there and fight. To his good credit, he felt that the odds were overwhelming, but he was under the belief that the Ark Royal, the Renown, and possibly other capital ships were waiting for him on the horizon. So he made the decision to scuttle the ship rather than continue the battle. It was seen during the day of the 17th of December that the crew of the Graf Spee were taken off the ship and it was left with just a skeleton crew on board. Nothing had been said by Langsdorff at this point, but obviously there was a lot of speculation as to what was going on. One of the other points that's been made is this whole battle became a massive talking point and point of interest for people at the start of the war. It's estimated that over 750,000 people came into Montevideo to watch this battle that they thought was going to happen play out. So it was a huge thing. However, the ship was driven out onto a mudbank. The skeleton crew were taken off and the ship was blown up. Say 750,000 people watching, and the news reports really did go worldwide. So it was an incredible battle and also an incredible triumph of intelligence or bluff over reality. Had the Graf Spee gone out there and done battle with the three ships, who knows what the outcome would have been. We shall never know. HMS Achilles, my father was a navigator, took command of the ship when the captain was knocked out with severe shrapnel injuries to his leg. The bravery and skill of the officers and men in all three ships was widely recognised. I think there were 4 Distinguished Service Crosses given out in Achilles, and similar numbers in the other ships. And it really was quite a technical triumph that these ships had managed to defeat the Graf Spee. And this is noted in the citation we'll see a little bit later. My father's approach was to try and steer towards the previous shell attacks, avoiding many of the subsequent volleys of the Graf Spee. And he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his efforts. There are some amusing comments. There was one yeoman who was supposedly giving a commentary to the many sailors who were on the lower decks of the ship, who was believed to have been killed at one stage, only for him to reappear on the tannoy and say, "I'm not dead." So it wasn't without its humour. And this is the citation on the Distinguished Service Cross. That's my father with the white scarf. And if you can't decode his writing, I'm not surprised. It says, taken while chasing Graf Spee into Montevideo, 13th of December 39, all unshaven and unwashed, but otherwise happy, captain wounded in both legs. So,
And he's showing us as well.
yeah, and you can see there, that's the captain with his legs all patched up. And there are some pictures of the bridge, which you can see was heavily damaged by shrapnel. After the battle, the two Achilles and Ajax went back to Auckland, and this was the greeting that they received. It really was huge. They were welcomed, and it was a tremendous victory for the Allies. All sorts of great dining and special passes. Even a film was made, which usually comes on Christmas time. It's worth watching. That's the Distinguished Service Cross my father was awarded. And that is the end of the slideshow. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions. I'm not a historian, but I will try and answer them.
Well, your father was a navigating officer, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
Specialised in that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Lovely story about your grandmother. Ordering, living in Glencoe,
Yes.
and the Ratcliffes had a Humber car, always brown. Humber cars were always brown. And the Cowburns ordered a Humber car, and they got the brochure and everything. And the salesman brought round a brand new Humber to Glencoe, and your mother, your grandmother, went round the car and said, it's certain horsepower, isn't it? Yes, she knew that horsepower. She knew the cubic capacity. She knew the size of the tires. She knew speeds and various things like that. And the salesman was most impressed with this lady who knew so much about cars. And anyhow, they went round the front, they went round the back of the car, and she put a dainty foot on the exhaust pipe, and she said, "What is that?" And she said, "Madam, that's the exhaust pipe." And he knew then that she knew nothing about it. But she read the brochure and she memorized all the numbers. So your father might have inherited this ability for numeracy.
This lady was my father's mother, who actually died long before any of us were born.
So I am indebted to Laurie. He reminded me on Sunday that HMS Ajax was actually scrapped at Cashmore's scrapyard in Newport many years later. And I think yourself and Henry and my father actually went to see the ship as it was being discovered.
Henry and I were allowed by Mr. Venables to go and take what we wanted off HMS Manxman, which was the fastest destroyer, fastest ship, British ship in the Royal Navy during the war. So we loaded up on board a Smiler with this wonderful amount of gauges and things. And I got an anvil, half a hundredweight anvil. I got the masthead light. I got so many things. We were just taking bits off this ship before the rest of it was scrapped. But that was a great privilege.
Sorry, question.